Nutrition for Food Service and Culinary Professionals, Chapter 11. Today we're talking about handling customer special nutrition requests. Just glance across a crowded dining room, a bustling hospital or a school cafeteria, or even an elegant catered event. Anytime, any place a group gathers for a meal, you can be sure there's going to be diners dealing with special nutrition needs. The one thing they all have in common is their desire to have a satisfying, flavorful meal. This chapter focuses on serving guests with some special, common needs. We'll discuss practical menu planning, preparation, and also some presentation techniques for a smooth operation. While the chef sets the tone, the servers also play a key role in demonstrating the operation's commitment to accommodating that person's special health needs by being knowledgeable about not only the ingredients but also cooking techniques, and also being able to communicate those concerns to the chef. So our learning objectives for today are identifying appropriate ingredients and menu items when customer requests foods that are not only low in calories but also saturated fat, sugar, and sodium. Since we laid the foundation with all of those different ingredients or nutrients, you'll probably have a better understanding of what those are. We're going to also describe how to set up a food allergy management plan in a restaurant, including why it's important. And then also, we're going to review what we talked about the other day about gluten-free foods that are appropriate for people with celiac. And then identify some appropriate ingredients and menu items when we're looking at lactose intolerance and also the vegetarian diet. Special diets are becoming fairly common. Our diet and our health, how big is the problem? Well, there's no question that food affects our health. We've studied that already, both in the short term and over a lifetime. As we've discussed in the first few chapters, diet plays a part in almost 7 of the leading causes of death: heart disease, cancer, strokes, and diabetes. And additionally, obesity is associated with increased risk of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, some cancer, hypertension, osteoarthritis, and even gallbladder disease. Some of the primary dietary risk factors associated with these diseases include high saturated fat, trans fat intake, low whole grain intake, and also low fruits and vegetables. On the other hand, high sugar intake, high refined grain intake, and excessive sodium also contributes to those issues. The food service industry can play a very important role in providing all guests healthful menu options. And that's the key. It's to provide just a choice. The whole menu doesn't have to be necessarily, fitting those guidelines. For those guests with special dietary needs, this is often such a valuable service. More than 1/3 of adult Americans suffer from some form of cardiovascular disease, and more than 800,000 adults die each year from heart attacks or strokes. It's really the #1 killer of both men and women. Approximately 1 in 3 American adults have high blood pressure. Because sometimes it's without symptoms, many people are even unaware they have it. While cancer is the second leading cause of death in the U.S., rates of new diagnosis and rates of death from all cancers combined with a decline significantly during the last decade for both men and women. And according to the National Diabetes Information Clearinghouse, approximately 26 million people, and that's about 8 to 9% of our population, have diabetes, and another 54 million have prediabetes. So, what's the motto of the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts? Be prepared. Be always in a state of readiness in mind and body to do your duty. So part of your daily regimen as a chef or culinary professional is to be prepared for those special needs without creating kitchen havoc. The best approach is designing your menu The best approach when designing your menu is to have choices that follow the basic dietary guidelines discussed in our textbook. So, again, being prepared and having a plan so that when something occurs, when a person asks for something special, it doesn't create a big mess for the kitchen. For special requests, have these basic preparations available. Things like meats marinated or rubbed with no salt, blanched vegetables reheated in a small amount of seasoned stock, and then just maybe finished with a little bit of oil, dips and chips for appetizers like hummus with whole wheat tortilla chips, maybe some, lower fat or healthier options for salad dressings, and then maybe some fruit-based desserts. Those are a no-brainer that everybody could appreciate, but they are basic preparations that are really beneficial if you have people with special requests. Considering whole food, as we've talked about all along, really makes a big difference in terms of what you can offer these folks. When you're doing any highly prepped foods with breadings, sauces, lots of salty items, it really creates more of a problem for that customer that has special needs. The following slides look at menus according to specific nutrients so that you can accommodate special requests from your guests. So if someone has a need for low calorie or low saturated fat, obviously you can adjust the size of the portion, and that's a no-brainer. And that is something that you can do by offering the same appetizer as you do an entree, and that way it's smaller in size and maybe less calories. You can also allow people to do meal sharing instead of charging a fee if that's possible. And then also, just portion sizes in general of all the food, and also making smaller plates like tapas or half plates like they do in a lot of Italian restaurants. Allowing customers to share can really, be a nice customer service for your guests. You can offer to put sauces and dressings on the side, and that way you're controlling the most nutrient dense, the most calorie dense food, I should say, like a salad dressing. It's going to be mostly fat. So putting it on the side, that person can control how much calories or how many grams of fat or saturated fat they're getting. Also look at balanced cooking methods and put those on the menu. Instead of all fried, have some broiled, baked, grilled options. And then, of course, looking at some of those sauces that we've talked about in the past that have vegetable as a base, like a salsa or a relish, or maybe fruit-based desserts. That's always a great option. So when you're looking at, your menu choices for low calorie, these things are very obvious. Pasta with vegetables, leaner protein sources like lean cuts of beef, lamb, pork, clear soups, not just creamy soups, offering whole grain breads as a type of bread for a sandwich. So you get the message. I mean, it's very obvious. Limiting the amount of fried foods, moderating the fatty food. And we've talked a lot about that, over the course of the semester so far. And, butter, oil, whole milk cheeses, nuts, those things really need to be used in moderation. When you're talking about grain products, anything that has a lot of fat like biscuits, cornbread, croissants, those things can be a little option, but maybe have some other options to go along with. This slide shows you a fruit-based dessert that goes along with the principles of a lower calorie menu item. It looks very decadent, but it's really more fruit-based. Now, if a client is looking for something that's low saturated fat, the key thing is menu planning. Key menu planning points for this audience are the same as those for planning a well-balanced diet in general. Including plenty of low-calorie menu items, fewer high-calorie items. People with cardiovascular disease are often overweight or obese, so they need fewer calories. So the low saturated fat recommendations kind of go hand in hand with the low calorie. Again, offer smaller portions, because even if you offer, like a pizza, if it's a personal size pizza, it's going to be lower in fat or saturated fat. Portioning is always the simplest way to manage those calories. And, like I mentioned in the other slide, be aware and mindful of the high-fat sauces and dressings and cheeses. Use healthful cooking techniques throughout the menu. Substitute other cooking methods for frying, whenever possible. If frying is necessary, serve a small portion that's accompanied by, garnishes or more vegetables. Or if it's a fried food, have the other side dishes be non-fried. Use heart healthy oils such as olive, grapeseed, or canola, and even use specialty oils such as nut oils, herb or spice flavored oils to add the flavor when you decrease, sodium. And you want to serve a greater variety of fruits and vegetables and also high fiber foods. So again, there's not a big difference. The main thing here is just what are the biggest sources of fat and saturated fat, and make sure that you cut back on those for the person who wants, who has cardiovascular disease. So, similar messages, but at the same time, very specific for the cardiovascular patient. If you want more information, refer to www.heart.org. That's the American Heart Association guidelines. So, as a part of a healthy diet, an adult consuming about 2,000 calories should be aiming for about 4 to 5 cups of fruits and vegetables, 2 4-ounce servings of fish a week, at least 1 ounce equivalent of fiber-rich whole grains per day. Keep sodium to less than 1,500 milligrams. Limit the amount of sugar-sweetened beverages to no more than 450 calories a week. Reduce the processed meats, no more than 2 servings a week. And then saturated fat should be less than 7% of the total calories per week. And again, I always like to refer back to the My Plate visual. If you follow that guideline and really understand quality food that you should be, considering serving, then those guidelines are fairly easy to follow. So why low saturated fat? Eating too much increases blood cholesterol levels, and that's a major risk factor for heart disease, which then, causes people to have problems with heart attacks and then even potentially strokes. So other risk factors for heart disease include overweight and obesity, and that's why even just curtailing the portion size or cutting back on the calories really helps, because most people who have heart issues, it's sometimes as a result of that being overweight or obese. Same thing with high blood pressure. As people age, generally their blood pressure increases as a result of that extra weight. And then, of course, lack of exercise, smoking, and diabetes. So cardiovascular disease is a group of diseases that are related to the heart and the blood vessels, and many factors increase our risk for cardiovascular disease, and they're mentioned here. Also, a diet high in fat and saturated fat. A lot of people, when they hear the word high cholesterol, they automatically think that it's the cholesterol food in the diet that causes high cholesterol. But like we mentioned before, it really is the amount of saturated fat in the diet that raises our risk for cardiovascular disease, because it increases those blood cholesterol levels, particularly the one that is low density lipoprotein. Arteries become blocked due to a buildup of the plaque on their inner walls, and this process is known as atherosclerosis, and it affects almost everyone to varying degrees as you age. But the major dietary cause of plaque formation are saturated fat and trans fats. So in addition to reducing those, menus that include soluble fiber are also beneficial. Remember when we talked about the carbs chapter and the soluble fiber and the insoluble fiber? Well, soluble fiber binds some of the cholesterol from food, and the digestive secretions increases elimination of cholesterol in the body. So it's not always about just giving up something, But in this case, it's also looking at adding beneficial fiber, to really help regulate that diet or to, benefit that person that is struggling with cardiovascular disease. So, what are some of the menu choices, for someone who has low saturated fat needs? And when you look at this, you'll notice it's whole food. Clear soups instead of cream, whole grain whenever possible. Veggie based side dishes, veggie based dips, leaner proteins, maybe some potential meatless entrees using tofu or maybe bean dishes, more plant-based options. And that's really what we're saying here. This slide just shows us a picture of a, creative way to display, and it looks like a lot, but it's actually a small amount of salmon, and then it also has some lentil salad to go with it. So the lentil and pea salad is giving you a complete protein. And if you look at that whole meal, it's a lot of food, but again, it's very low in fat and it's very low in saturated fat, even though the fish that you're choosing here is a higher fat fish. And another thing to consider here is the type of fish you're choosing, salmon or Arctic char. Those are really going to be higher in omega-3 fatty acids. So the type of fat you're choosing there is very beneficial for, reducing the stickiness of the platelet cells. So it actually helps to, reduce cholesterol levels. Many customers are looking for low sugar items and are trying to avoid added sugars. And I reiterate that because a lot of people actually come to a restaurant and they want the fruit taken out of the menu. And obviously, if that's what they want, that's what you have to give them. But know that fruit is not high in sugar. It's higher in fructose, which is a type of sugar, but because of the added nutrients and all the fiber you get from fruit, it's not in the same category as added sugar. So, generally when customers are looking for low sugar items, what you want to provide are things that are, fruity, that don't have a lot of added sugar, like granulated white sugar, like high fructose corn syrup. Those are added to food as a sweetening, as a flavor, and they're added to food or beverages at the table. So if you really want to dive into this a little bit further, page 344 of your textbook lists menu choices for low sugar diets. So there's a lot of those, as an example in your book. And that's why I always say get the book, because it's such a great reference and you can always refer back to it. And as I mentioned, many times, fruits work so well on a low sugar diet, although I have to admit that many customers are very misinformed and think that fruit is high in sugar when it really isn't, from the perspective of nutrition and health. Okay, diabetes is another concern that people have. We have an awful lot of diabetes in our country. Diabetes is a chronic metabolic disease, and it's when your body has either inadequate or ineffective insulin. And this causes high levels of glucose, also called blood glucose. Many people refer to diabetes as sugar diabetes, and that's really an incorrect term. Generally, there are two types of diabetes. There's type 1, and that occurs earlier in life and generally requires daily insulin injections or an insulin pump. Type 2 diabetes, which is much more common, and until recently generally occurred later in life. It's now reported that 1 in 3 children born today will develop type 2 diabetes in their lifetime. So what I'm saying here is that a lot of the children that are struggling with diabetes, it's become an epidemic in our country, are struggling with diabetes, and that's why type 2 is no longer called adult onset, because so many children are getting diabetes relating to their obesity. This type of situation can be controlled with diet, or diet and pills, or diet and insulin injections. So many times when a person presents with symptoms of diabetes, they will really try to control, their blood sugar levels and their condition with food first. And then if that doesn't work, they're always going to follow the special diet, but they might have to add some pills to control the sugar. And eventually, when their pancreas is not secreting enough insulin, they have to have injections. Being overweight and inactive increases the likelihood that you're going to develop type 2 diabetes. But early in the condition, small amounts of weight loss and also improved eating lifestyle can really be enough to control that blood sugar without medication. And, 9 times out of 10, doctors are going to suggest that because they don't want a person to have to go on medication. But many people with diabetes seek the services of a registered dietitian nutritionist for nutrition education about their diet. So it's not like you have to be an expert in this, but it's certainly very beneficial for you to have a level of understanding. So what does a healthy diabetic diet include? Well, first of all, we used to use exchange lists for meal planning. And now the more accurate way of teaching someone who is younger, who is diagnosed, is carb counting. But the general guidelines are this: limiting foods that are high in sugar. Because obviously when you eat plain sugar, it causes your blood sugar to rise and fall real rapidly. So the goal is to maintain as even killed blood sugar as you can. Another goal is to spread your meals and snacks evenly throughout the day. And also it's important to eat about the same time every day. So consistency is a really key, factor for diabetic diet. Being careful about how many carbs that you eat and when you eat them. So at every meal, there should be carbohydrates. And just like we talked about for a normal, healthy person, carbs should make up the majority of the food on the plate, but it's really important to consider how many they're getting and when they're getting it, and how important it is to combine it with other food groups. So eating a variety of whole grain foods is important because of that extra fiber. Same thing with fruits and vegetables. It gives you the added benefit of the extra fiber that you don't get from other foods. And then if a person's overweight or obese, then obviously their calories would be limited just because it's, important to take in less if you're trying to lose weight, as well as, moving your body more. So the overall emphasis is on healthy eating. I hate to say that it requires a special diet, but, people do have to be a little bit more diligent than the average person. Those with diabetes benefit from eating a variety of food with basic healthful food plan emphasizing whole grains, fresh fruit, moderate serving sizes. And just like any other person, their diet should also be low in saturated fat and trans fats, because even more than the average person, people with diabetes are higher risk for cardiovascular disease because diabetes affects the entire circulatory system. And carb management is important, but for the sake of being a culinary professional, it's important to just understand how critical it is to offer lower carb alternatives. Like for instance, spaghetti squash instead of pasta with a marinara. So when you're using spaghetti squash, you're substituting a non-starchy carbohydrate for a starchy carbohydrate. So your calories are so much less, and the nutrient value of that vegetable is so much greater. So when we talk about that sugar in general, there's relatively little room for added sugar, especially when you're diabetic, because you want all those food groups in so that you're generating a better nutrient variety. And when you eat sugar, you're substituting a food that only has calories for one that has a lot of nutrients. And people with diabetes can't regulate their blood sugar by eating too many of the sweets. The amount and types of food and eating at regular meal times, again, is extremely critical. Meal plans are tailored to meet individual needs. So, for instance, if I was working with a diabetic, I would always do a food history and also a food frequency identification just so that I knew exactly what they're doing and how I can help tailor their plan so that they control their blood sugar better. So their plans are tailored to meet individual needs, their food preferences, their medications and lifestyle, and they're usually planned by a registered dietitian. Some people recommend carb counting, others use the exchange system. And for myself, I really kind of tailor it to the desire and the ability of the client. If I'm dealing with somebody who's elderly, try to keep it as simple as possible. So again, you're reducing starches. Carbohydrates are starches and non-starches, but starches provide so many more carbohydrates per serving and also provide a lot more calories. So to help reduce starch, you want to offer more non-starchy vegetables. So instead of the potatoes, the peas, the corns, even though they're decent, you want to have a boatload more of broccoli, cauliflower, green beans, asparagus, bell peppers, mushrooms, etc. And you want to offer soups, preferably clear soup, like broth-based soups instead of creamy. That way you're reducing the fat. And then also offer soups that don't have a lot of noodles or starchy vegetables. So there's options, and it may take just, tweaking some of those recipes. And then again, when you're serving anything from the starch category, it should be 100% whole grain if at all possible. This one's very common. Most Americans really need to reduce their sodium intake. Most Americans eat more sodium than required. There are some statistics that say that Americans eat up to 8,000 milligrams a day because of the amount of highly processed foods. And what happens is too much sodium increases the fluid volume in the arteries and therefore causes an elevation in blood pressure. So there's several sources of sodium in the diet. One is actual salt. Salt is made up of sodium and chloride. So 1 teaspoon of salt has 2,300 milligrams of sodium. Now, if you reflect back on the dietary guidelines for Americans, it suggests that 2,300 should be the ultimate limit. But if you're over 50, it should be 1,500 milligrams, and that's per day. Many times restaurant items are way more than that in just one item. And again, highly processed food is going to be higher in sodium. If I looked at a chart that had the sodium content of food, like for instance, pork tenderloin or pork chops are going to be, moderately low in sodium. There's natural sodium in those products. But anytime you process it for it to become sausage or, bacon, the sodium raises, 100 times. So processed foods are the ones that really tend to increase and elevate the amount of sodium in our diet. So some things you can change and alter in the menu that you're making, some you can't. If there's a marinade or if there's a sauce that's already pre-made and has high sodium ingredients like the soy sauce, MSG, Worcestershire sauce, ketchup, barbecue, a lot of the Asian sauces. There's so many that really have a lot of sodium. And if your food is marinating in it, or if you are typically cooking with those, it's very difficult for that person to really, have your food fit into their diet. Why is it such a problem eating too much sodium? Again, blood pressure is the force of blood pushing against the walls of the arteries as it flows through them. When blood pressure is measured, there's two numbers that are reported. One is the systolic and one is the diastolic. So there's two numbers, one on the top, one on the bottom. The systolic is the pressure created when the heart beats while pumping blood. And the lower number, the diastolic, is the pressure created when the heart is at rest between beats. So blood pressure numbers are written with that systolic number above and the diastolic below, like 120/80 millimeters of mercury. A healthy resting blood pressure should be about 120/80 or below that. High blood pressure can be caused not only from, excessive sodium intake, but many factors, including genetics, smoking, stress, increased weight, diet, and inactivity. So the body's sodium level is a major factor in regulating that blood pressure. Sodium helps to maintain fluid and electrolyte balance in the body, and it also helps to regulate heartbeat. So some sodium is necessary to do the work, 200 milligrams a day. And that's essential for life and health. But at the same time, because of the quantity of highly processed foods, we have a problem with dietary excesses. Reducing sodium in the diet generally reduces blood pressure, but the American public really enjoys high sodium food. So that's the challenge for culinary professionals, to prepare lower sodium foods, to make them taste good, flavorful, that can help diners really try to control their sodium intake. Some of the key nutrition points are to try to consume, 1,500, really less than 2,300 milligrams a day. More than 75% of the sodium in the diet comes from processed food. So whole food is always recommended. We've been saying that for, weeks and weeks. That is the message we, promoted in the very first chapter. The DASH diet is something that's very important when we're talking about sodium and blood pressure. The DASH diet is recommended as not only a prevention but also a treatment plan. It's a heart-healthy, nutrient-rich diet, and it's based on research supported by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. The diet recommends eating whole food, fresh and frozen, and limit highly processed foods, and a reduction of sodium to 1,500 to 2,300. So if you'd like to, dig a little bit deeper into that topic, there's a lot of good references. One is on the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute website. Just search DASH diet, DASH, and that stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. It's also been proven, it's scientifically proven. The clinical trials were done 21 years ago. So this DASH diet has more substantial evidence than any diet out there. And that's why for the past 8 years, the U.S. News and World Report has actually designated that the DASH diet is the #1 diet that's helpful not only for lowering blood pressure, but also for weight loss, for controlling blood sugar, etc. Your instructor has actually co-authored 2 books on the DASH diet with a colleague and also a cardiac doctor. But if a customer is asking for low sodium, these again are some of the things that you really want to avoid. Regular soup bases. Like a cup of regular broth can contain as much as 1,000 milligrams. And if you're trying to keep your intake of sodium at 15 or below, you can see how one little item can just blow it out of the water. So it just makes sense that everything should be whole food when at all possible. Whole food, what I call whole food, is nutrition by addition. And that's when foods work synergistically to help reduce blood sugar and keep heart healthy. So you can take supplements and you can do all these different things, but it's really eating whole food that's going to matter. And instead of always focusing on what I have to give up, begin to start thinking more positively about how I can add food to make my diet more nutritious. And everybody will be happier. So how can you reduce sodium? We've talked about a number of these, but using less salt, train staff to taste food before adding salt, because it's just ingrained, with culinary professionals, the use of salt. Kosher salt and sea salt don't necessarily have less sodium, but because of the granule size, when you're measuring teaspoon for teaspoon, you're getting less granules, which means you're going to get less sodium per serving. But it's still a sodium chloride compound. So whenever you're buying food of any kind, you want to be sure that your vendors can provide information on lower sodium products. And then also explore other methods of boosting flavor. We talked about herbs and spices, but umami is really, really important too when you're reducing sodium. I want to refer to a little bit about salt because there's a lot of misconception, and I thought this was a good time to do it. When I think of salt, I think of sodium chloride. Some regular salt has added iodine and also maybe some anti-caking agents. Sea salt and other natural salts have small amounts of additional minerals that may add color and other subtle flavors. But one thing I want you to think about is it's not an advantage necessarily because they have the minerals. You wouldn't want to use salt for the minerals. You would want to eat other foods to get the minerals, like drinking milk to get the calcium. So even though they have some minerals, you're not using salt as a high nutrient dense food. Salt's most obvious impact is on taste, but it also serves other functions in cooking, such as increasing the water binding capacity of proteins and increasing the juiciness of meat and poultry. It also helps to stabilize batters and extend shelf life through its antimicrobial effects. So, it's important, but we've just gotten to the point where we enjoy more than we need. Sodium reduction in the American diet is really an emerging concern, and awareness of how much of it contributes to health, is really something to think about. And there will continue to be more and more of a demand for food options with less sodium. So the more we can jump on the bandwagon, or the earlier we jump on the bandwagon, the better for everybody. Following repeated petitions from the Center for Science and the Public Interest and other advocacy groups, the FDA is really has done some, different things like removing salt from the GRAS list, which is generally recognized as safe. So what about salt, and what about all these different kinds? There's white, there's pink, there's gray, there's black. Salt comes in many colors and forms and is found all over the world, just depending on where it's harvested. Each variety has some of its own unique characteristics. So if you're enjoying that type of thing, it's important to experiment with the unique colors and flavors as garnishes, for maximal visual and also taste impact. But when you do that, remember to reduce the amount of salt in food as it's being prepared. So we have a lot of different kinds of salt in our diet. And like I mentioned, table salt, for instance, is the most common kind of salt. It usually comes from salt mines and is refined with most minerals removed until they add the iodine back in. Sometimes there's anti-caking agents such as calcium silicate, and that kind of helps to prevent all the clumping. Table salt is usually the preferred one in baking for its fine-grained texture and accuracy of measure. One teaspoon is 2,300 milligrams of sodium. Iodized salt, back in the 20s, people started getting problems with goiters. And in the 1920s, they decided that because of the increased number of people in the country that were getting goiter, they decided they were going to actually add it to iodized salt. So iodized salt is actually considered a functional food. It was one of the very first. So, the body requires less than 225 micrograms of iodine a day, so that would be a benefit for using iodized salt over anything else. We also have coarse salt, which is just larger grained, sea salt crystals. It's less moisture sensitive, so it resists caking. It's often used as salt crusts on meat and also fish. And then, of course, we have kosher salt. It's named that because it's used in the preparation of meat according to the requirements of Jewish dietary guidelines. So its little craggy crystals make it perfect for curing meat, and that's a step in the koshering process. Generally contains fewer additives and also has a more salty taste than just plain, ordinary table salt. It can come in a flake form rather than a granule form. The flakes dissolve easily and have a less pungent flavor than table salt. So many chefs really enjoy using it. And again, because of measuring it per teaspoon, you're getting a little bit less product than you would regular table salt. And then, of course, we have our rock salt, which is composed of large, hard, chunky crystals, and those are often used to regulate temperature when making ice cream, like in an ice cream maker. So it's, rock salt. And then, of course, we have pickling salt, which is commonly used to brine pickles and sauerkraut and turkey at Thanksgiving. So another type of salt is sea salt, and that's a real broad term. It generally refers to unrefined salt that directly comes from the ocean or the sea. It's harvested by channeling ocean water into large clay trays and then allows the sun and the wind to evaporate the water naturally. Generally, the manufacturers of sea salt don't refine it as much as other kinds of salt, so it can contain a few extra minerals like iron, magnesium, calcium, potassium, manganese, zinc, and iodine, and that's what imparts that different color. And usually it'll come either coarse or refined. There's a whole lot of other ones too, like smoked sea salt. It's naturally smoked over wood fires. And then there's flake sea salt, which is, reminiscent of snowflakes. There's Celtic salt, and it refers to moist salts that are harvested from Atlantic seawater off the coast of France. There's Fleur de Sal, Fleur de Sal means flower of salt, and that's an artisan sea salt composed of young crystals that form naturally on the surface of salt evaporated ponds. They're hand harvested, under specific weather conditions by salt farmers, and it's really done in a certain region of France. It's considered probably one of the more expensive, more special salts. So there's a whole lot of them: grinder salt, gray salt, Hawaiian red clay sea salt, Hawaiian black lava sea salt. Obviously, that's where they're harvested. And then we also have salt substitutes and light salt. Salt subs, they totally take the sodium away, and it's made from potassium chloride. And they can taste a little salty, but most people really complain that they're actually very bitter. Light salt, on the other hand, is a combination of the sodium and the chloride. So a lot of things to consider, isn't there, when you're talking about any number of ingredients in the culinary business. So salt is an issue that we all struggle with just because so many things are salty, and we've kind of gotten used to that. But I have to admit that when you lower your intake of sodium, it's very easy to lower your threshold on what you like in terms of saltiness.